Thank you, Richie, and welcome everyone. Dr. Jean Williams-Woodward is an associate professor and extension plant pathologist at the University of Georgia and is based in Athens, Georgia on the main campus. Dr. Woodward came to UGA after receiving her bachelor's degree and master's degree from the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and her Ph.D. in plant pathology from the University of Minnesota in St. Paul. She is primarily responsible for developing educational programs on diseases of ornamental plants and their control in commercial greenhouses, nurseries, and landscapes, but also works in urban and commercial forestry, Christmas trees, and legume forages. She works closely with the UGA Plant Disease Clinic in Athens and is responsible for developing disease management and recommendations for commercial, ornamental, and forestry samples. She also teaches courses on plant disease diagnosis, clinical plant pathology, and ornamental pest management. Welcome, Dr. Williams-Woodward. The floor is yours.
All right. Can you all hear me okay? Just want to make sure I'm sounding all right.
Perfect.
Great. Okay. I am going to talk about today the troubleshooting of common and kind of not so common plant diseases in the Georgia landscape. There are just a ton of diseases, and actually trying to narrow down some of these things for today's talk is difficult. So I do want to leave some time at the end that if people have specific questions they want to ask about some of the diseases I may not touch on, then to please ask them at the end. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today are some of the fungal leaf spots, some of the bacterial diseases, powdery mildews and branch and stem cankers, Phytophthora, root and crown rot. Then I also want to leave time for Boxwood Blight and rose rosette virus. Those last two diseases are the ones that are actually causing the most problems right now for the landscape, other than just plant death. To talk about some of the fungal leaf spot diseases, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this at first is that every plant in the landscape has a disease, has a pathogen on it. And actually, it's a challenge every time I hear some of the horticulture faculty who will talk about this is a pest-free plant. And I just sit there and think, challenge accepted, because there is going to be a pathogen that's going to affect that plant. Most of them are pathogens we have are fungal pathogens. Most of the products we have to control, to manage plant diseases are really fungicides, which are geared towards fungal disease control. They're not going to work on some of the other plant pathogen groups. But fungal leaf spot diseases are typically like this picture here. This is a Photinia with the red leaf spots. And the red leaf spots are actually the fungus, are caused by the fungus Entomosporium. You can see a lot of thinning branches or thinning foliage. One of the common problems we have with fungal leaf spots is that they tend to cause a lot of defoliation. I mentioned that almost every plant has a leaf spot pathogen associated with it. There are many different fungi that cause these different leaf spots. There's no way for me to actually in this talk tell you about every single pathogen that's out there. So I want to go through some common characteristics associated with fungal leaf spots. This is just a compilation of just 4 things here. One is the discula on the birch, which is this one, that's that yellow leaf. Most of you may have seen this problem on birch, usually later in the summer when all the leaves turn yellow and they drop. And pretty much your birch is left very bare, except for maybe the growing point. You may have like green tufts of green on the ends of the branch. You can see here those tan spots that are associated with the leaf. They are scattered irregularly around that leaf. It's not a very uniform spotting. If we're seeing something that is a pattern that is very uniform on a leaf, then I start thinking it might be something more like a chemical spray injury, but diseases tend to be very hit and miss and very random in their occurrence. The one that we are seeing a lot more right now is the Cercospora leaf spot on Crepe Myrtle, and this is actually being seen right now. I have it on my own plants. There are a variety of different there have been a few variety trials where people have evaluated different crepe myrtle cultivars for their susceptibility to this leaf spot. And Matthew mentioned about the IPM for shrubs book or tree book. I'm going to show you that as well. In this case, with the Cercospora leaf spot, one of the things you notice is you can see the brown spots that are associated with on the leaf, but then you're also seeing a lot of yellowing and reddening. It almost looks like the plants are going through kind of early fall coloration. So they're getting those pigments in the leaf, and then those leaves will drop. So again, many of the very susceptible varieties will almost be completely bare after a few weeks of infection. Another one we see quite often is a septoria leaf spot on Rudbeckia. This is the one that causes these black spots to develop on the leaf. They eventually can cause the entire leaf to turn black and the actual plants to just die off in the landscape. And they can actually kill some of the Rudbeckia within usually the first year, but often Rudbeckia will self-seed, and so you'll get new growth coming up. One of the problems we have with fungal leaf spots is that these pathogens, the reason the spot is occurring is that the pathogen is a necrotroph. So it's actually living off of and reproducing on the dead portion of the leaf. So when you have that leaf spot and it is a dead section, the fungus is actually able to reproduce on that area, and they're going to be producing spores that will sit there and survive on that fallen leaf litter until the following year, when rain or irrigation water splash will splash those spores onto the new growth of the plants for that new growth in that year and cause more leaf spots. So if you see leaf spots that are developing sort of from the bottom of the plant and moving upward, it's a really good clue that the pathogen is surviving on those in that fallen leaf litter that's surrounding that plant. So if you're seeing something that's coming in and just hitting the new growth at the very top, that could be a windborne pathogen that's being spread just either in through the wind itself, like powdery mildews will be spread that way, or will be through wind-driven rain. So we have those really severe, heavy kind of rainfalls with a lot of wind associated. That's what's going to actually spread a lot of those pathogens around as well. The one in the upper right here, this is oak leaf blister. I wanted to put it in because it's a little bit different in that it causes this kind of cupping or kind of swelling that occurs on the leaf. There's actually a convex, where the underside of the leaf is actually pushed in, the upper part of the leaf is pushed out. So it's this cupped appearance of the leaf. In the early spring, you get these light green kind of patches. If you turn the leaf over, it would be white underneath. But then as the leaf ages, those patches turn tan. So in some of these areas up here in the upper left-hand side, they'll turn tan. So in the summertime, you'll look at your oaks and see just brown patches on the leaf. And it's probably oak leaf blister that occurred in the springtime. The thing about a lot of our fungal problems and fungal pathogens is that they like moderate temperatures. They like a lot of moisture. Typically, they're more spring and kind of late summer diseases. Spring associated with young new growth, as well as our spring rains. And then late summer, because that tends to be our pattern of late afternoon thunderstorms. This year, we're actually, it's been a strange year for the wintertime, as well as also this summer. We're very wet right now. We went through a period where we were very dry. I'm seeing diseases that typically I would not see until maybe August. They're now showing up now. And so we're off on when things would actually happen. And that's sort of the problem we have with some of our calendar kind of mentality of when things normally happen, is that it is entirely environmentally dependent. And if it's very cooler, moderate temperatures, especially cooler nighttime temperatures, as well as associated with a lot of moisture, we're going to see a lot of these diseases happening sometimes weeks ahead of time when we normally see them. One of the things getting a lot of questions about is actually about ornamental cherry trees and a lot of leaf drop. The leaves are turning yellow. Their leaves are falling and dropping from the tree, and people are wondering what's as a quote unquote kind of killing my tree. This is kind of symptom of this leaf drop is very characteristic of some of the fungal leaf spot diseases. And in this case on the cherry, it's actually due to what we call shot hole leaf spot. This shot hole name happens because you get the spots that you get a rusty brown spot that as it ages drops out of the leaf, leaving this shot hole appearance. The leaves tend to turn yellow very quickly. It's a plant defense. Oftentimes when they are so severely infected by leaf spots, they're no longer contributing to photosynthesis within the plant, and so the plant's defense is actually shedding them, that they're not needed anymore. Now, all of these leaves drop beneath the plant, and that's actually where this pathogen will survive until next year. Some of the common characteristics about some of these fungal leaf spots is that, as I mentioned, they like those warm days, cooler nights, high humidity, and also prolonged leaf wetness. Most of our plant pathogens will require anywhere from 4 hours to 12 hours of leaf wetness in order to for that fungal spore to germinate and get into that plant. Some of the ones that require the least amount of time are things like some of the rust pathogens, but many of our fungi are going to require a minimum of 4 hours, and they prefer much longer periods of time, up to about 12 hours. The spots tend to have these tan to gray centers. They're surrounded by darker borders. There's also the biggest characteristic is that they have fungal fruiting bodies, or spores can often be seen within those leaf spots. And this is something that does differentiate fungal leaf spots from like bacterial leaf spots. Fungal leaf pathogens account for probably about 80% of our disease problems. Bacteria diseases in Georgia probably account for 10% or less of the problems. But if you're looking at, I've got a spot on my plant, is it caused by a fungus? The thing you need to be looking for are these kind of structures that are imaged here at the bottom of the page. We often have structures that look like little blisters like this. They're actually raised areas. They really do look like a water blister. This actually happens to be black spotted rose in the right-hand side. You may actually see spots that look kind of dirty or kind of fuzzy in the center of them. That's actually spores. And this is the iris leaf spot that you can see the spores from a microscopic perspective are very large. And so you can see those spores within the center of the spots. And then this picture on the right-hand side is the Entomosporium leaf spot again. And this one's on Photinia, but it's the same leaf spot that gets onto Indian hawthorn. You can see in the center of these spots, these black little dots. Those black dots are the structures where all the spores are being produced. So if you do not have a hand lens, magnifying glass, something like that that's going to increase the magnification, get one. Because this is the first thing when someone hands me a leaf and says, what's wrong? If I'm out in the field, I'm going to pull out my hand lens and I'm going to look and see if I can see structures within those spots. If I can see structures, I know it's a fungus. I may not know exactly which fungus is causing the problem, but I know that it's a fungus. And if it's a fungus, then I know that fungicides might actually be of some benefit. I mentioned already about defoliation is very, very common, and that these fungi, they reproduce and survive on that fallen leaf litter. Okay. Now I want to get back to, I mentioned about these pathogens being necrotrophs. They kill this tissue that's here. So when we are looking at fungicide use, most of the time people contact me and say, what can I do? I've got all these spots all over my leaf. Well, the problem is that's dead tissue. Fungus has already killed that tissue in advance of itself. And no matter what you throw on that plant, you're never going to get a green leaf again. So you can't treat diseases in a kind of reactive way. You can't wait till you see all the symptoms showing up and then try to treat them and think you're going to have any effect on that disease at that time. You could treat plants that do have leaf spots. Hopefully you're catching the very early symptoms, maybe spots that are showing up on those lower leaves. But what you're trying to do is protecting new growth that's coming out or leaves that are not already infected. So when I mentioned about timing of when things happen, is as you're looking at these leaf spots, keep records of when you see it. So you know that I tend to see Cercospora leaf spot on my crepe myrtle, and I tend to see it maybe August 1. Well, infection happened about 2 weeks prior to that. So if you're trying to preventatively spray to try to reduce disease development, then your first spray has to be about 2 weeks prior to you seeing that disease. So some years you're going to miss it, but then you need to make those records so that way the next year you can come in and preventatively spray for those diseases. So when we talk about management of these leaf spot diseases, and pretty much any disease, is know your plants and know what diseases they can get. There are the websites, books, there's plenty of resources that actually say these are the problems that these particular plants tend to get. Also keep the foliage as dry as possible. Matthew mentioned about timing of irrigation, and the best time to actually irrigate is when there is already natural periods of leaf wetness. Typically that is early morning because those plants are already picking up dew at that time. If the worst time to irrigate is actually late in the day and into the early evening hours, those plants are going to be wet, go through, in that time period, they're not going to dry out before darkness. So when it's dark, you're not going to get evaporation off that leaf. The leaves are going to stay wet. In the early morning hours, they're going to pick up dew again, so that's extending that period of leaf wetness, and they're not going to dry off again until the sun comes out. Okay. So if you can irrigate in the early morning, that's the best time. The other thing for landscapes is avoiding all overhead sprinkler irrigation, is irrigating through using soaker hoses, drip irrigation, emitters that are down lower in the plant or in the plant canopy, so that way the foliage never actually gets wet. Now there are years, we're in Georgia, and people have asked, I get joke about it, but it's like they ask what's the perfect environment for disease, and I say Georgia, because Georgia truly is a wonderful place for disease. And it's our environment. We have the weather we've had recently, and where we've had moisture, a lot of rain. This is perfect for disease, and it's one of the reasons where I'm seeing a lot more kind of leaf spot diseases showing up. And then because we're having our cooler nighttime temperatures, even though it's hot outside, at night it is dropping down, and it's the cooler nighttime temperature that actually is contributing, creating that environment for the diseases to develop. So don't irrigate late in the day. Try to keep the foliage as dry as possible. Increasing air circulation can help with that, with the rate of drying. So sometimes selectively thinning branches can actually help to try to make sure that you're getting some air movement in and around those plants. One of the problems I have, and Matthew, I don't think you did talk about this, but is how many plants are planted in one square area of a landscape bed. And people want an instant landscape. So they go in and you have a lot of plants being planted in a very small area. Within a few years, all of those plants are overgrown and they are just covering each other. They're growing into each other. And when you've got that dense canopy like that, you're going to see a lot more diseases because those plants just will not dry out. The other thing here is I've got in red is sanitation. Removing old leaf litter, and as well as also removing infected plants, is going to help you in trying to reduce disease problems. Mentioned most of these fungal leaf spot diseases, you're going to see a lot of defoliation. The pathogen's going to survive on those fallen leaf litter. Even tiny little pieces of leaves were still enough to have for that pathogen to actually reproduce, produce spores, and those spores to get back onto the new growth the next time or the following year. I mentioned about applying these fungicides. Ideally, we're applying them preventatively, trying to reduce that first infection. We're trying to keep the spots from ever occurring in the first place. The other thing I mentioned was keep a record of when you see the diseases, when they start showing up in the landscape, and looking for that early symptom development. Mentioned the fungicides applied after the leaf spots are there are not going to have an effect. Fungicides after symptoms are just going to protect that new growth or plants that are not already infected. And if you've got a plant that is just a problem plant, there are plenty of other good plants that could go into those areas. So if it's a plant that you always see a ton of problems on, then maybe it's time to actually change out that plant and put in something else that's less problematic. I mentioned about difference between fungal leaf spots and bacterial leaf spots. Bacterial leaf spots, they are less common in Georgia, mainly because bacteria like it really, really warm. So we see bacterial problems developing in the summertime for us, and they like high humidity, warm days, warm nighttime temperatures. And so if you were in Florida, you'd actually have a lot more bacterial diseases than we do here in Georgia, particularly North Georgia. The leaf spots, they are water soaked. That's the appearance like in this spot here, where the spots look actually very oily looking. Especially if you look at them from the back side of the leaf, they often follow the leaf veins. Bacteria, if you've got a bacterial leaf spot, if there's water sitting on that leaf, bacteria will ooze out into that water droplet. And then as that droplet rolls down the leaf, it will carry that bacteria with it. So we will see these kind of symptoms of things happening right along the leaf veins. Like in this case, this is a bacterial leaf spot on the oak leaf hydrangea. We'll also see oftentimes a yellow halo around the spots. So you can see this is a bacterial leaf spot on magnolia. The spots are actually very angular looking because the spots are bordered by the leaf vein. But you are seeing a lot of yellowing right around some of those spots. And so the water soaking, sometimes bordering the leaf spots that are bordered by the veins, as well as also leaf spots that seem to be concentrated along the veins. And that yellow halo is a symptom of, or all characteristics that tell me that this is a bacterial problem. The other thing I'm looking for is, do I see any kind of fungal leaf spots or fungal fruiting structures in the center of the spots? And so if I'm not seeing that, but I'm seeing that very kind of greasy water-soaked appearance, then it's more likely the bacterial leaf spot. As I mentioned, the control really for bacterial leaf spots and fungal leaf spots are pretty much identical. Water is the big key factor involved, and how long those leaves stay wet is going to determine how much bacterial infection you have. The big key difference is that if it's a bacterial leaf spot, you are extremely limited on your chemical control options. Really all you have to deal with or to use with it for bacteria are really some of our copper fungicides. The copper hydroxide, copper pentahydrate, those products are really, that's about it. Most of our other products we have for our fungal leaf spot diseases, they do not have any activity on bacteria. The problem we have, as Matthew mentioned, is that repeated use of the same products can develop resistance. So if you're dealing with a bacterial leaf spot and all you're doing is applying copper products, one application after another, then you're just building up resistance within that population. And eventually the coppers are not going to have any activity or an effect at all. The other problem we have is just coppers, is copper toxicity of too much copper actually being out there as well, especially in the environment. The one thing about I didn't mention, I just thought about, is about rotations and how often you have to apply different products. With things like copper products and trying to control a bacterial problem within the landscape, you really need to be applying a copper product every 5 to 7 days. And that's because these products are non-systemic. They sit on the leaf surface, and if it's raining or there's a lot of irrigation water being applied to those leaves, it's washing off this copper. And so if you're a landscaper who's getting back to a landscape once a month to do the maintenance on it, applying coppers are really not going to have much benefit to you, because the copper products doing one application is not enough. Most applications for our fungicides to try to really slow down and stop our diseases, it tends to take about 2 to at least 3 applications of a fungicide. That stops the pathogen population enough that you're no longer seeing disease spread. The other thing with applying those 3 applications of a fungicide is that if the fungicides are applied every, say, 2 weeks, you're extending the control of those fungicides' activity on that plant for about 6 weeks. And in those 6 weeks, the environment changes, the plant starts hardening off, or the leaves are no longer susceptible, as well as now we've suppressed the pathogen for that long, and now that they're no longer able to infect as well. So it's, when you're using fungicides, you kind of are playing that waiting game. So you're hoping the plants start hardening off. You're hoping that the environment changes and it's no longer conducive to the infection, as well as the pathogen is no longer active. Okay. One of the other bacterial diseases, and one of the other few bacterial diseases we do see, is fire blight. This is a crabapple, and you can see the shoot that is killed here. That shoot is killed because the fire blight bacterium got into, at bloom, it got into the flower. And when it got into the ovary, it actually moved down into the vascular tissue of the plant and caused the canker. That canker then resulted in the death of everything above that cankered area. And so you see these flagging that happens. It affects all rosaceae plants, which include like apple, pears, crab apples, pyracantha, the cotoneasters, and like photinias. This infection we saw actually quite a bit this spring, and it's because it likes to have warmer, wet conditions, and we had a fairly warm spring. We had almost no winter, and we had the fire blight showing up much earlier than we normally see it. This fire blight, it's perennial within that plant. So if you have a pear tree or a crabapple tree, if you leave those branches that are showing this kind of symptom, then next year, as the sap starts moving through the tree, it hits those cankered areas, and you get oozing of sap as well as bacteria from those cankered areas. Then as bees start moving around the plant, they're walking through that sap and that sugar, they're actually picking up bacteria, and then when they're going and collecting pollen and nectar from the flowers, they're actually depositing the bacteria again. So the best thing you can do for things like fire blight is actually prune off these dead shoots. And you have to prune them off and prune out at least 8 to 12 inches below where you see the dead portion of the tree. So you would actually, this dead branch tip here, you would go back and actually prune back into this green wood, because the bacterium is within that vascular tissue, and you never know where it is within that portion. So if you prune back far enough, you're hoping that you're not picking up bacteria on your tools. And then the other thing about sanitation is that as you go and you are making another cut, you should be disinfecting your pruning tools so that you're not spreading the disease to those cut wounds on the next cut. I am going to talk about boxwood blight and talk about disinfecting of pruning tools as well there. But there are many different things you can use to disinfect pruning tools. You can use a 10% bleach solution. You can use alcohol, rubbing alcohol, the 70% alcohol. You can also use Lysol concentrate or a dilution of the Lysol concentrate. You could even use the new Lysol cans, the ones that are the aerosol, the ready-to-use aerosols, and you can spray things down with that. The other thing is really wiping them down, like with old t-shirts or cloth, wiping them down to try to remove some of that sap as well. One of the really common diseases and things that people, probably the easiest ones most people recognize, is really powdery mildew. And I wanted to put this in here because right now it's just perfect powdery mildew weather. Powdery mildew is actually, it's a disease complex that's caused by many different host-specific fungi, but they all cause the same sign. So people will see powdery mildew showing up on all kinds of plants within the landscape and think something is spreading. And really, the mildew that's actually on, say, like crepe myrtle, is only going to crepe myrtle. It's not going anywhere else. And the mildew that's actually happening on the hydrangea is going to hydrangea. That's about it. But what you tend to see is this white powdery growth, which is really just hyphae and spores. So hyphae are the fungal thread-like material. So if you looked at the leaf underneath the microscope, it would actually look like a webbing of white growth. And then this white color actually is coming from a lot of the spores that are present there. The powdery mildew is the one exception to the rule that diseases need a lot of water in order to develop. Powdery mildew actually is inhibited by wet leaves. So if you kept leaves wet all the time, you would never have mildew. But you'd have every other disease known on those plants. So powdery mildew, though, likes really high humidity, warm days, cool nights, and oftentimes low light. The high humidity is what's actually causing this disease to really develop right now. So even like this morning, it was very warm yesterday, temperatures dropped at night. This morning there was actually a bunch of fog in some of the low areas. When you have that fog area, that's a perfect environment for some of this powdery mildew to develop. And what I'm even seeing right now is our powdery mildew, it's on crepe myrtles. And it is showing up like in this picture here in the upper right, where you can see the new buds are covered with this white powdery growth. And even some of the flowers, they will also turn white, where you'll sit there and go, the leaves just, or the petals have lost all their color, and really they're covered in powdery mildew. And we're seeing this because of the environment we have. The other thing with powdery mildew you will often see is sort of a purpling. Sometimes the powdery mildew growth may not be very evident, but you'll see a lot of purpling. And that's because the powdery mildew is actually growing within that leaf tissue. So if you think about a cross section of a leaf being like a brick wall, the bricks are the plant cells, and then the mortar area is the intercellular spaces. And within those intercellular spaces, that's where a lot of the hyphae is growing. And then the hyphae is actually causing this haustorium. It's like a little, basically a storage, or it's a, I kind of view it as more like a potato inside a leaf cell. It's something that's actually absorbing nutrients from those leaf cells. And so as it's in there, it's affecting the plant's ability and normal function, and it actually can be depriving some of the nutrients from it. So you get a lot of purpling associated with powdery mildew as well, sometimes also some yellowing. But this is in on dogwood, and you can see this purpling showing up here in these spots, even those areas that are not showing a lot of white powdery growth. That is still powdery mildew infection. For when we look at control, the best powdery mildew control method is really using resistant cultivars. There's a lot of areas of plant breeding right now that are looking at powdery mildew resistant cultivars. Things like crepe myrtles are a classic example, but hydrangeas, phlox, even dogwoods have a lot of powdery mildew resistance. The crepe myrtles are the classic example because that was, it's the crepe myrtles that actually have, most of them have the Indian names, are the ones that have some of the more resistance. There's a whole nother breeding programs that are developed, and they don't have, that are named other things, not the Indian names, but the Indian names made it easy for people to remember. One of the things that you will see, though, is even though the plant may be called resistant, it doesn't mean they're immune to the disease. It just means that they get less disease. So we will see powdery mildew showing up on those powdery mildew resistant cultivars. It's just to a lesser extent. And oftentimes it is either at the very tips of the branches, like on the flowers, like in the case of the crepe myrtle, or it's going to be on the suckers that are coming up from the ground. And it has to do with the environment and humidity levels within those areas and how much air circulation there is around the plants. So when we look at control, we are looking at things like resistant cultivars, as well as also improving air circulation, trying to reduce even shading by maybe selectively pruning out and thinning branches to improve airflow and actually more light coming into the plants. And then also applying fungicides preventatively. There are products, one is called Millstop, that is one that I recommend a lot. That is sort of it's a baking soda kind of a product. It's a calcium bicarbonate. That it is a product that will change the pH of the leaf as well as desiccate those spores that are sitting on the outside of the leaf. But there's many other different fungicides, typically in the fungicide classes, the triazoles or the strobilurins, that are very good on powdery mildews. One thing about powdery mildew control is many products will benefit from actually having a spreader sticker included. But read your fungicide labels. Some products actually already have different types of surfactants already included, and they will say, do not add anything. Other products will say, disease control is enhanced by the addition of a non-ionic surfactant. So read the labels and see if the product you're using works better with that surfactant in it. One of the things we are finding even with powdery mildew control is that often the spreader stickers or some of the surfactants, like Latron B, actually controls mildew itself. So just the use of those products will actually reduce some of the powdery mildew as well. Matthew mentioned this book, and I wanted to put it in here too. This is the IPM for Select Deciduous Trees in the Southeastern U.S. Nursery Production. There is a Crepe Myrtle chapter that's in this book, and as Matthew mentioned, it is free, and you can get it actually from this website here. But there are cultivar tables inside this book, and so if you were looking for a new Crepe Myrtle that you wanted to put into some area, or you wanted to know what is the resistance level of Crepe Myrtle I already have, if the plant has actually been evaluated for either disease or insects, those ratings are found in some of the tables that are in this book. So look at the book and you can determine which one is going to have most resistance that I need, or what some of the cultivars, the resistance ratings are. All right. The next question I wanted to ask is really like, what's killing my plant? I get this question all the time, probably 50 times a day, with what's killing my plant. Here's my theory for what's going on right now if your plant is dead or dying at this stage. Most of the times the plants that are dead, because there's various degrees of death within pathology, it's due right now to environmental stress and possible root disease or root injury. Years of drought stress, followed by wet years in 2014 and 15, then were followed by excessive drought and heat stress in 2016, all kind of culminated into a lot of damaged roots. And so we're seeing entire plants just dying this past year. This plant here is a Cryptomeria. If you're seeing an entire plant that is just turning brown and dying, then that's a good clue that the problem is in the root system. If a plant is just dying individual branches, it could be a canker, which I'll touch on, but if the entire plant is showing something, then it's probably a problem in the roots. The one thing I did want to mention is I get a lot of calls about this Cryptomeria and about a lot of branch and tip dieback that happens. So you may see whole branches dying off, or you could just see little tips of the Cryptomeria turning brown. All of this is the newest growth that is coming out. I never find a pathogen, or hardly ever find a pathogen associated with any of this tip blight, especially like this blight that's shown here on the right-hand side. It is typically, my theory again, is it is due to root environmental stress. So if the roots are not taking up a lot of moisture, those needles on the tips or the growing points, they start wilting, but you really don't see wilting. They just become stressed. And that all we're finding coming off of those needles is really these secondary stress pathogens that come in and infect damaged and weakened tissue. If I take those pathogens and try to inoculate a healthy Cryptomeria, I do not get infection at all. If I'm seeing whole branches dying off, oftentimes this is the same thing that affects a lot of our lelands. It could be the bot canker, or it could even be ceridium canker. If it's cold, sometimes it's associated with cold damage, especially if it's the leader that is dying, and it is another fungus called Phomopsis. There is no control for that other than pruning out those dead branches. In the case of this needle blighting here, most of these needles are going to fall off, and so those tips will fall off. So if you can avoid the root stress, then you should be able to, the new root is going to come out, and hopefully we won't see the same type of symptoms developing. If you are seeing things like the branch and stem cankers, or kind of a plant, this is a laurel where just one section of it died. Follow that dieback back and see if, when you're following that stem or that kind of branch back, see if you start seeing areas, like in this case here on this lower right-hand side or left-hand side, you'll see a darkened area here. And actually, if you go down, it was just off the image, there is a canker. There's a border right in here that is where there was a branch canker. So somewhere along here, there was probably a wound and a fungal disease. We have many of them. Typically, it's bot canker that comes in. There's quite a few different fungi that are in that collective kind of cause, or that collectively cause bot canker. The infection gets in. Oftentimes, it's wherever there's a wound, a bark crack, insect feeding, branch or kind of a tip dieback. It could be from split bark from freeze damage, but it's some kind of wound that actually happens. And if you were to take your knife and scrape through that area, you'd see this branch, this canker kind of delineated area. So this area up here to the left, or to the left of it, is darkly discolored. That's dead tissue. Nothing's it's going to kill everything above it, and there's no way that's coming back. This lighter colored area is actually still healthy. And so the only thing you can do is come back and prune this out and prune down further than this. And hopefully you're going to get back to the buds like Matthew was talking about, where this branch, where you can get some new growth developing off that branch. But this is happening typically because there's some kind of wound. If you can go back, follow it all the way back, and it goes down into the soil line or down to the ground level, then the problem may be originating in the root system. And I'll talk about that here in a second. Lelands are going out all over the state. Most of it is still due to the ceridium canker. Ceridium canker is a fungal canker disease that comes in on typically drought-stressed and wounded trees. The planting lelands very close together, like in this picture here, where the branches, every time the wind blows, the branches are rubbing against each other and you get these abrasion wounds, is enough for this fungal disease to get started. There is no control for this. The only thing you can do is prune out some of these branches. But if you look here in this area where I'm pointing at, you can see you've got brown branches, entire brown branches, but then you can also see this area here is like lighter yellow. You can also see it up here right underneath the word ceridium in that tree. There are many different cankers within those branches, and so you can prune off all those dead branches and still the next year and even a couple months later see more branches browning. It's because it takes time for this disease to get developed into to the point where it's going to affect the water flow moving through that branch and actually end up killing that branch. This is associated with root stress oftentimes. Irrigating trees during a drought period will actually help to reduce this disease development. But there is nothing you're going to spray on those trees that's going to stop this disease from developing. I mentioned about dieback that goes down to the soil line. If it does go to the soil line, typically you are going to see these root and crown diseases. Most likely, the problem is going to be Phytophthora, and that's this word here. Phytophthora is a water mold. It is a pathogen that does require a lot of moisture in order to infect and to spread within the landscape. We will often see areas like this hillside of juniper where you can see the scattered kind of dieback that's occurring. that kind of dieback and pattern is typical of some of the root diseases. Oftentimes it will be associated with either lower portions of the hills of a slope, or it could be where plants where there's a lot of irrigation, and you can find patches of it developing along that slope. People think that because it's a slope, it has good drainage and you can't get a root disease, and that's just wrong. You can still get root disease developing on slopes like this. But plants that start dying back, the whole plant is dying, or stems that are going down to the soil line, look for that as being potentially the root and crown disease. You often can get the lighter discoloration. The whole plant may start turning off color, like in this case, this was a juniper. And you can see some are more the darker green and blue, and then other ones are more that yellow-green color. You can also see these, this is a lyria that has the big blue variety that actually has the foliage, the lower leaves, and the interior foliage, those leaves are dying off. And so you can go up to them and they'll just pull right out of the container. Or around the ground. This is actually a Phytophthora crown rot as well. And then in this case here, it's more juniper. You can see the dieback is occurring. We're getting brown branches, but also the roots are very dark. Now, most of our roots for our woody ornamentals tend to be dark color anyway. So the thing you need to look at is to scrape the outer root cortex and see if the inner part of that root is brown, or if it is more of a creamy kind of color to it. Matthew mentioned a couple of things about root disease and pruning or cutting the roots. This picture here, that's the junipers that are in the small containers, the 1-gallon containers, that was a retail garden center. And so almost all of your plants that you buy or get from a nursery have some level of root disease in them. And the main reason for that is that you have these plants are grown in black plastic containers sitting out on a black kind of ground cloth covered nursery bed. The heat generated when the sun is hitting those plants in the summertime can be intense within those containers. And we've measured temperatures in excess of 140 degrees Fahrenheit in 3-gallon containers when that measurement was taken 1 inch from the soil, from the container wall. 140 degrees is enough to cook the roots. So when you're looking at root systems, pulling things out of containers, one side of that root ball always looks dead. And that part that looks dead where there's no roots, that's the side that faces sun. And because there are no roots there, you have root disease. There actually are roots there, you just can't see them. They've been killed and you no longer can see them up against that soil. And these root pathogens take advantage of those damaged roots, and they will be in that area. So I do recommend you actually taking a knife and cutting away some of these roots, especially the ones that are rotted. They can be down at the bottom of the container. They can be also on the sides of the container, just to remove the pathogens and try to reduce the spread of it into the landscape beds. If you are looking at seeing dieback and mentioned about the branch cankers from wherever that canker may be, if it was a root and crown disease, particularly for Phytophthora, and you followed that dieback going all the way down into the soil, at the soil line, if you took a knife and scraped right at the soil line, and areas like in this case, this is a Fraser Fir, but you can see the dieback that's happening on the right-hand side of this tree, and you can see this rusty brown discoloration inside that lower stem. That's where the Phytophthora is. The other side still has some green branches here, and that's because that side of the stem is still alive. Same thing with this root system here. You can see this lower discoloration on the stem. If you were to cut through that, it would be all darkly discolored wherever this the infection is, and then above it, you would still have some green until the plant dies. The thing that's going to kill the plant is this crown infection, because no water, no nutrients, nothing is going to be translocated through dead tissue. And so the whole plant is going to show symptoms. Okay. When you are looking at root and crown diseases in the landscape, these diseases tend to almost always be associated with wet soils. It can be from too much irrigation, excessive rain, poorly draining soils, or kind of soil compaction. If you plant the plants too deeply, then you get that secondary root system that Matthew had shown a picture of. If you plant something too deeply, then those roots are stressed, and those roots are going to be slowly growing. And if they're slowly growing, they are so much more susceptible to root infection. So the ideal goal when you're planting new plants is actually get those roots established and out into the existing soil as quickly as possible, because the longer they just sit there and do not move, the more likely they are to actually start getting some infection. This whole thing of planting too deeply, injuring the roots, that is what's going to, I mentioned, slow the root system down and actually cause some, or be a reason why the plants may become more infected. Matthew mentioned about cutting the roots and actually making them more susceptible to infection. I personally believe get rid of some of those rotting roots and you're going to have less infection of the remaining roots because you're not keeping the pathogen around. We've got to get the disease organisms out and away from those other roots to try to reduce this disease. The management of root disease in landscapes is all the same. It pretty much revolves around changing the site conditions. It's looking and seeing, is it a low area and is water kind of a pooling in those areas? If so, you've got to change that site. You do not want to overwater or over-fertilize. If you over-fertilize, you actually stress the root system out, which makes those roots kind of leaky, which is actually more attractive to the root pathogens that are there. It would stimulate some of the root pathogens, those spores to germinate, and actually they are chemotactically attracted to those root systems. And if there's wet soils, there's pathogens like Pythium and Phytophthora, those water molds, they produce spores that will actually swim in water, and they'll swim towards those growing points or to those root systems. Okay. You do want to remove infected plants. If the plant is already dying, don't think you can come back and kind of cure it, especially if it is a root problem. It is not going to be cured, and it's always going to be a problem plant. In beds that have had a history of root problems, especially in some of our flowering annual beds, like this picture here of the pansies, incorporating products like subdue granular product or using like a root shield, which is a biological control product, it can help in those beds. So you would basically incorporate these products, turn the soils and kind of evenly distribute those products into those beds, and then you're planting your plants into those beds. Drenching plants, I get a lot of calls. People want to know, what can they drench? What products can they go out and kind of try to do this rescue treatment on a plant that has root disease in the landscape? And drenching in a established landscape is almost always ineffective. The effectiveness is determined by how compacted the soil is and what type of soil type you have. If you've got a clay soil, if you're applying a drench to the soil surface, most of that product is running off across that soil surface and not penetrating down into the soil to even hit those root systems. And you'd have to get the product down to where those roots are in order for them to be effective. In a sandier soil, you'll have a much greater chance, or a looser kind of garden soil, have a greater chance of getting the product down there to actually have that drench be effective. But in some of our heavier clay soils, drenching is not effective. So I want to touch on the last two things, is really the Boxwood Blight and the rose rosette. Boxwood Blight, just to give you an update, we are seeing it. It is quite prevalent this year. We first found it in Georgia landscapes in 2014. It's now in numerous landscapes. Many of them are in and around the Atlanta area, but that's only because there's a lot of boxwoods there, as well as also it's not that it's just basically that's where all the boxwoods are and where people are planting some of these very formal gardens. Introduction is often through new plants. There are nurseries that do have Boxwood Blight in them. We do not have production nurseries in Georgia that have Boxwood Blight, but other states are seeing Boxwood Blight in some nurseries. And anytime we have found it in a Georgia nursery, it has been on brokered material that has come in from either North Carolina or from Oregon. And so, but we do see it. This year, we also saw it in a re-wholesale nursery. So these were plants, again, were brought in and they were already infected. Some of those plants were purchased and actually transplanted. So the introduction is often through infected plant material, but movement has also been attributed to landscape maintenance, such as pruning, doing shearing, or just coming in and pruning and working in and around the boxwoods. Possibly also like pine straw workers who are coming in and moving and putting pine straw out, and they could have spores actually on their clothing and could be spreading it that way. The other thing is through pet activity. Unfortunately, people's dogs and cats are being blamed a lot for the spread of this disease. The type of symptoms we see is this browning, this dieback of all the boxwoods here. You can see individual stems dying back. Sometimes the entire plant is showing it. But the biggest symptoms we see are, we'll see leaf spots developing, like these brown spots. This one is a typical fungal leaf spot, kind of characteristic of a tan spot with a dark border. They are typically, if they're in the center of the leaf, they tend to be round. But if they're on the edges of the leaf, it looks like the whole edge of the leaf tip is actually dying back. We also see black stem lesions developing. And then the biggest thing is a lot of defoliation. So in this case here, this is a one that was found in a nursery on brokered plant material. And this is the picture of that block. So in this block of boxwoods, symptoms may actually be very difficult to see. If you were just driving by, you may not notice it. But you can see some yellowing in the lower left-hand side here. And you can also see some yellowing and some dieback up here in the upper right-hand corner of this block. If you see suspicious symptoms, do not ignore it. We had a case actually in Atlanta this last year, or 2 years ago, in September of 2015. Homeowner said, that looks suspicious. The landscaper said, no, that's not Boxwood Blight. And by January 2016, that's what their garden looked like. So if all of you are freaking out about it, you should be. All of this whole garden was boxwoods. And this disease, because of the fall we had in 2015, if you remember back, it was extremely wet and it was very cool, moderate kind of temperatures, which created almost like the perfect storm for this disease. Another picture of this same garden. Oops, I went too far. Is this. You can see all of these are boxwoods that are dead. And these conical shapes here, they're also boxwoods, but the blight is here at the bottom of this. This blighting, the reason they thought it moved through this garden so fast was actually because of they thought it was their dog activity happened. This year, what we also are seeing is this is a Dwarf English, and you can see instead of being tan or brown or showing a lot of spotting, the leaves are just looking olive gray and greasy like, and they're just dying. The other thing we're seeing is this here is these are boxwoods, Dwarf English, planted underneath an American, but down here all of these plants are showing Boxwood Blight symptoms. And if you look down on the ground, you can actually see little leaves, and they're falling off, and they're green while they fall off. So here too, you've got green leaves that are falling off. So don't think because you haven't seen spots that you don't have it. It could be Boxwood Blight and just showing different, its symptoms are showing up differently. The disease is inhibited by hot temperatures, and so it may not be very obvious in midsummer, but as we start getting into the fall, it will become much more obvious. The spread is oftentimes through worker activity, water splash, blowing of leaf debris, or it's carried on tools or clothing, or it's carried on animal fur. The spores are produced, they are elongated, and they're almost in these little packets of spores. They're very, very sticky. And because they're very sticky and they stick together, they are not blowing around in the wind. These spores are being carried on something to get introduced into a garden. So if no new plant has been introduced into that garden, something brought it there. And if we're seeing dieback coming from the top like in this case here, this is a good clue indicating that this disease was brought in probably through the maintenance operations. So through the pruning of operations of this hedge. The other thing, this is my favorite cat picture. This was a neighbor, one of the homeowner's cats, as we were talking about how the disease could spread from one landscape bed to the next. I mentioned that, you know, their animals could be weaving in and amongst the boxwoods, and they could be picking up spores, picking up leaf debris, and moving it to new landscapes. And this was her cat. And as we're talking about it, the cat was weaving through the boxwoods, and as it left the landscape bed, it had a little infected boxwood leaf attached to its tail. And that's exactly how this disease was spreading around through this person's landscape. If you're talking about management, it is extremely difficult. If you see it, you need to bag and dispose of those plants. So you need to discard those infected plants immediately. Bagging and disposing means dig them up and put them inside a bag. You don't want to transport them on open bed trucks. You also do not want to put them into compost or coal piles. You want to bag them and seal them and get them into a landfill or away from that land, from any possibility of it spreading, a chance of it spreading to new plants. You also don't want to just pull up the plants and walk with them across a landscape and put them into the back of a truck, because as you're dropping leaves all across that yard, it's just a chance for that disease to spread to more areas. You also want to try to remove as much fallen leaf litter and dispose of that. It can be through vacuuming the leaf litter up. We've also used propane torches to actually burn some of the leaf litter up, especially if it was leaf litter in like walkways or in and around a landscape bed. I mentioned about disinfecting tools. You also need to think about your shoes and your clothing. And one of the products that is best for some of the spores is actually this Lysol concentrate. It's up here in the upper right-hand side. This is where you'd mix it at about 2.5 to 5 tablespoons per gallon of water. You can mix it in a spray bottle and then keep it in your truck and just spray it. You can keep your tools, the longer you keep the tool wet with the product, the greater activity it's going to have, but a minimum of 10 seconds is enough to actually kill spores on like pruning tools. This is the Lysol spray disinfectant container. That's the ready-to-use products. They actually are very good as well. They've changed the formulations, and so this one contains 58% ethanol, and as well as also this dimethylbenzyl ammonium saccharinate. It is effective, and it's something that you could get a toilet brush, put it in your truck as you leave a place, scrub the bottom of your shoes to get off loose debris and soil debris on the bottoms within the kind of nooks and crannies of your shoes and the soles of them, and then spray the bottoms of your feet with this Lysol. And hopefully we can try to keep the spread of this disease from moving from place to place. Preventative spray programs, fungicide programs are effective. You can spray the plants down with chlorothalonil, fludeoxonil, or thiophanate methyl, or even tebuconazole or other triazole fungicides. And I know I'm going through this fast, but I'm going to leave you with a table. But you can spray plants down preventatively, and people are doing a boxwood preventative spray program to try to reduce the spread of this disease. After you have infection, fungicides are not going to be effective. So it's truly a preventative thing. If you have infected plants, then you also need to go and not just remove that infected plant, but also the plants adjacent to it, and probably up to 3 plants away from that infected plant, because the infection's probably there, you're just not seeing it. A lookalike is actually Volatile Blight. This causes a lot of dieback and stem dieback, foliage turning kind of bleached white or very tan. And I know I'm rushing through this to try to get you all through, but the big symptom characteristics that are different from Volatile Blight, from Boxwood Blight, is with Volatile you do not get defoliation. With the Boxwood Blight, you see a lot of defoliation. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with is really rose rosette. Rose rosette disease is something we are seeing that I cannot even recommend planting roses anywhere in North Georgia anymore. It is a disease that is spread, a virus disease that's spread by an aerified mite. This is the mite up here on the upper right-hand side. It looks like that little yellow kind of torpedo. The mite lives within the buds of the plant, the flower buds and leaf buds. It is very difficult to find it. You cannot see this with a hand lens. You cannot like shake the plant's tissue over a white piece of paper and look for something crawling. You will not find it. You have to look at it through like a dissecting microscope and tease the tissue apart to really find it. Its infection, the virus, what it causes is a lot of this red proliferation or reddening growth, as well as a proliferation of shoots. So you get this rosetting symptom that's shown here. You also will get the excessive thorns. So in this case, you can see the stems here with just a lot of thorns coming out. And these thorns are very pliable. You can bend them. It is found throughout North Georgia and south through Macon and even down into Dublin, Georgia. There is a theory that the mite itself cannot survive extreme heat, and so it may not be in South Georgia or in Florida, and this is the reason they think it's not in some Florida landscapes. But throughout North Georgia, we see it a lot. And almost every heavy landscape bed that has a lot of roses in it for color, a lot of our commercial landscape beds, this disease is present. This is in a landscape bed here that the roses actually don't look too bad. The plants here in the foreground look all right, but you can see these shoots sticking up, like up here in the upper right hand or left hand side. Those shoots, those red shoots for the proliferation is rose rosette disease. And what eventually happens is that within about 2 to 3 years from after infection, you start seeing a lot of dieback and a lot of stem death associated with those rose rosette infected plants. And that's due to carbohydrate depletion. The rosetting and the reddened foliage will not photosynthesize. And so you start getting no nutrients, basically no carbohydrate storage in the crown. And so the plants end up dying. Okay. It has been found in nurseries. We have found it in production nurseries, and it is a systemic disease. It is something that you cannot prune it out. You have to, if you see these infected shoots, you could prune it, and that helps to make the plant look better, but you're not taking care of the virus. The virus is actually throughout that entire plant. So the recommendation is to remove those infected plants as soon as you see it, and hopefully by removing them, again, bagging them and removing them, is that you're removing the mite. So if you remove the mite, hopefully we're reducing some of the spread of this disease through a landscape bed. And last thing I'm leaving you with is Matthew talked about this regional pest control guide. I mentioned some of the different fungicides throughout here. This is available online. You can get to it through this website, or you can get through it through this our SNPM website. This is Southern Nursery IPM group website. And this book has tables that give you information about what products are available for you to use on different diseases, as well as also insects, as well as weeds. And also what's in there is a relative effectiveness of various chemicals for disease control. So it's similar. Matthew showed a slide that had talked about IPM with the insecticides. This is the same type of thing for with insects or for diseases, excuse me, and where we've got the active ingredients and different diseases across the top, and whether the products are poor all the way up to excellent in controlling those diseases. And that's the website for it. So I was really rushing, and that's all I have for this one. So I'd be happy to take some questions if we have time.
Well, thanks a lot, Gene. We're about 20 minutes after 10. Probably should hold off on questions. We had 3 questions come in, one from Greg Huber. Jake Price wanted to know about Boxwood Blight in South and Coastal Georgia, and then somebody wanted to know about knockout roses. If you could briefly go over those,
sure.
Appreciate that. But I appreciate this was, both of these sessions were like drinking from a fire hydrant. So folks, these will be archived, and you'll be able to go back and watch these. But Gene, that's one of the best pathology talks I think I've ever seen. So very good stuff, and a lot of good information. So if you could We had one question here from Greg. It was when pruning out fire blight, is there a particular time of year when the pruning wounds would be least susceptible
Right.
to pathogens?
The best time of year to actually prune out fire blight is right after you see that stem dying. So once you get those flagging, you need to prune that out at that time. You do want to get it out because the bacterium will move within that branch, and so the quicker you get it out, the better. But then also disinfesting those pruning tools. If you leave it in through the summer, we tend to get what we call like secondary fire blight infections, more like bacterial leaf spots that develop on that foliage nearby. So get them out as soon as you can is the best thing.
How about
as far as sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to go. I know I saw the one about the Boxwood Blight, whether it's down in South and coastal Georgia. And right currently, I have not received a sample from anything that's down along the coast for the boxwoods. Most of things have been up in North Georgia, and a lot of it concentrated in Atlanta area as well as up in Rome. The Rome one was actually a landscaper probably moving it from Atlanta to Rome. And that's basically because that's where we're seeing a lot of these parterre gardens, a lot more money in some of the Atlanta Buckhead area, and that's where we're seeing a heavy concentration of it. It also, I'm looking for it. We're trying to get isolates and trying to know where it is and trying to work with landscapers to try to prevent it. If you don't have it in your gardens now, do not bring any new plants in. If you do have it in a garden, if you try to go back in and replant with another boxwood, you will have failure. And so in many cases, if you have this disease in those areas, the only thing you can safely go back in with is Japanese holly. And so holly grows. Some of the products like or the cultivars like Soft Touch do have that same kind of boxwood look to them. And that's about only thing you can do, because even though there is some varietal differences for some of the boxwoods in their susceptibility to boxwood blight, some of them won't show symptoms, but they still become infected, and they become sort of this Trojan horse. They will be the thing that's going to spread it to adjacent boxwoods that are very susceptible. And we've also seen, and depending on the environment, even some of the Korean boxwoods, which are less susceptible to the disease, if you have the perfect storm environment like we did in that fall of 2015, those boxwoods are killed just as much as like a Dwarf English, which is very susceptible. So then I know there was a question about knockouts too.
Yeah.
And we are seeing rose rosette on every rose out there. It traditionally was at first found on multiflora roses, so some of the wild roses we have. It's on knockouts, it's on drift roses, flower carpet rose. I have it in my own yard on Julia Child, which breaks my heart. But it will get onto pretty much every rose.
Had one last question here too, Gene, about miticides. About with the rosette virus, can you spray a miticide to kill those mites? Is there anything systemic that might kill the mites? Do you know? There
are some miticides that are better for the aerified mites. Will Hudson has recommended things like some of the abamectins, like the Avid, that they do have activity on aerified mites. But if you have the virus symptoms, that virus is already within that plant. So spraying those plants that have symptoms is not going to do anything for the virus management. You have to get rid of those virus-infected plants, and then you're spraying all the ones that are not showing anything with the insecticides to try to prevent mites, the movement of that aerified mite into those plants. And in some cases, you may not be able to go back in with roses again if there are virus-infected roses anywhere nearby. To give you an example, in my front yard, I cannot plant a rose because my neighbor across the street has rose rosette infected roses. And any plant I plant in my front yard gets rose rosette, and I cannot get my neighbor to actually remove their roses. So but I could spray my roses with an insecticide, with a miticide, and hopefully be able to try to protect them, but I'm just not willing to do that.
All righty, folks. I think that's about going to wrap it up for today. We appreciate everybody attending and sticking with us through the webinar. two really good presentations. Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Matthew. Folks, don't forget in today or tomorrow or hopefully by Friday to scan your sign-in sheet and send it to gtbop@uga.edu. We'll add some information to that. Get that off to the Department of Agriculture in the next couple weeks, and you'll get your category credit or your public license credit. So, or your private license credit. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Gene. Thanks, Matthew.